Hey guys, so today you and I are going to talk about recognizing technology. So let's get into it. So the question in question was, Frederick, how do you recognize where technology is going? Well, I think it would be a bit I, I don't want to be presumptuous because well, I know that some people might think my coworkers have joked about that as well. When I've said that I don't actually know all the things, I promise you I don't. I really, really don't. And some joke and say, "Are you sure?" And I go, "Yep, I'm very sure," because the the sad fact is that there are so many things in technology that I have no clue about. None whatsoever. I find it very interesting, and I'm always on the hunt for someone who can teach me or show me something that might be new or not something that I'm all that familiar with. It's just difficult for me sometimes to find things that are still relevant to the sort of work that I do, and seems to be, which is the key thing here, useful to have an eye on. Uh, this is a little bit of a, how do I put this? Uh, this it's difficult for some to admit this. But I know everybody admits it to themselves. It's just that nobody ever thinks that it's their idea that is going to fall into that bucket. And that is that not all things are made equal. And the sad fact is, guys, that the technologies that I keep track of are usually the technologies that are going somewhere, or the tools that are moving in a direction where I can see that this is going to continue being relevant for quite some time. But then there are, and this is actually the tip that I usually give to people who say that front end is so big and like there's so much going on, and I go, yes, but most of it is noise. Almost all of it is just pure noise. And when you get to develop a bit of a sixth sense for what is actually worth your time and investment, and what is just something that the people who don't have a strong understanding usually bet on. I mean, that doesn't necessarily mean that you or myself, in this case, I'm always right about this sort of stuff. But imagine if you're like a really serious stockbroker or like investment person or something like that, you can sort of you know the market so well that you know what's going to be a very bad investment and what's going to be a good investment, and so forth and so forth. And sure, sometimes there are these sorts of uh, like events that happen that go really, really big, become super, super popular, and then a lot of people hype it to the skies, and you go, yep. You can ride it up if you're really clever. You might be able to ride this thing up, but you can't, like, it's not a good long-term investment because this thing is going to come falling down on its ass very quickly. And these sorts of technologies, I never spend any time on them because I have no interest in investing in, how do I put this, transient stuff, if that makes sense, like short-term tools. I'll give you a good example, which is like I don't spend any time whatsoever looking into off-the-shelf CMS solutions, such as, say, WordPress, Gatsby, Django, etc., etc. That's not because these tools are not being used. It is just that I know that that is the direction, that the sort of development that is being done using those tools will never reach a point where it is considered to be the mainstream choices for large-scale systems development, which is this thing that I do. It's never going to get there because the trade, it's not designed for that level of development. It is designed for a different use case, so I don't need to I completely ignore it. And same thing with other technologies that I ignore them, not because I don't find it interesting to have a sort of understanding of it. I mean, I've built WordPress sites before and I've used Gatsby and so forth, but it's not something that I'm gonna like invest in because I know that it could be, this thing can be around for 100 years most likely, and it's very unlikely that it's ever going to develop into something more than it is today. It could, I don't know, but that's the trend that I'm seeing. So when I look at the technology, I look at it in terms of relevance to the stuff that I am interested in. So when I look at, say, something like Kubernetes, now, how do I recognize where this technology is going? Well, it's the same thing I've spotted when I saw Docker. When Docker first came out, my first thought was, this is a very good investment to have a look at. The reason why I had that idea is very simple, because most of what you want within the software space today is circling around one very specific thing, and that is that you want more out of each unit of a software developer that you have. In other words, you need to create abstraction layers that simplifies the work process, deployment, and overall like the pipeline between the laptop all the way out into production for the software teams. That is the biggest challenge that the software industry is facing at this point. As I said, like to say, the problem is always complexity over time. How do you manage it? And that is something that Docker, or like the idea of containers, not Docker specifically, but the idea of containers, it is a genius innovation in solving that sort of problem. So I keep track of it, because I know that this is going to stay relevant for a long time. And the next thing that's coming up that is very interesting, that is also up, is sort of like this idea of having serverless or things like that, doesn't mean that I think that that's going to become the next big thing. What I'm saying is that the idea of simplifying business logic to the point where, as I say, you get to the sweet spot. So WordPress and Gatsby and these sorts of things, they might be too much for large-scale systems. But there is a level before that, which is, in my argument, is that that's where a container or like Docker or so forth, that's actually what it is. It's the same thing when we started doing virtualization with virtual machines, as opposed to using, just mainframes and things like that, where the idea behind the VM and the container, like a VM is just the grandparent of the container. If so, serverless would be the next step, if that makes sense, right? And so the way that I look at technology to sort of figure out where it's heading is in terms of how well does this thing actually address the fundamental problems of the development process. That is the only measurement I have, and that's not something that I can teach another person, because it really comes down, it's sort of like, an investment broker teaching people how to read the market. It's a sixth sense. You develop it over years and years of experience working with different tools and learning how to do work in different environments, and how people's like trends work, and how different companies think, and like what they prioritize and so forth. And this is one of those reasons why I say to people, like, you can say that Java's gonna die for the rest. Java is more likely to outlive you than to die, and that is not because it's the best language in the world. It is because I know how software companies work, usually. And as I've said before, guys, just because something is new, it doesn't mean that it becomes a thing. And that's why you probably never will see things such as, say, Svelte or like one of these new JS frameworks take over. They're probably not going to do it, because, as I said, they are too late in the market. And they don't provide, as I usually say, they don't provide a strong enough motivation for migrating. Docker did. Docker provided a technical solution to a gigantic problem in the industry. Same thing with Kubernetes. These tools solved an actual pain point for companies that, as I said, that caters to the exact thing I was talking about. They cater to the simplification and streamlining of the development process. Svelte does not. Vue does not. And so tools like React and Angular, who are bigger brands and so forth, there's like no competition there. So I don't actually have to keep a lot of track of them, these sorts of tools, unless I'm in a region where these things are actually very popular. So as I said, it's not about saying that one thing is better than the other. I'm saying that if you're going to look at where things are heading, you should look not at the specific tool that you are using right now. You should look at the idea that tool it represents and how it is solving a problem. The problem is the thing that is interesting. So then SBA, for example, that is an interesting idea, But the manifestation of the solution, well, that's a different thing. We don't know what's going to come up next. Maybe WebAssembly becomes a thing or so forth. I don't know. But I hope that makes sense to you when I say that the idea that I follow is that I'm not so concerned with which specific tool we're talking about. I'm looking at what is this tool solving for the IT industry, and what are the real problems of the IT industry, and how well does this tool solve that specific issue. That is the thing that makes me figure out, like, okay, where is this thing gonna head? So what I want you to take away from this is that the way that I recognize where technology is going is very simple. I simply look at the use case of the tools that we are looking at and figuring out whether or not it's going to head somewhere or not. So an example would be the hype around machine learning and so forth and so forth is like the biggest thing right now. But I can also tell you that the amount of people who know how to do that right is this big. The reason being very simple because the use cases for machine learning are specific. They are there. There are some features that are very useful, but the hype at this point is higher than the usefulness of machine learning algorithms, and that has nothing really to do with the fact that this is not something that is going to continue growing. It has to do with it's the same thing I say about Rust, for example. Rust has the idea, it has a solution to a problem that is on par with the same sort of thing that Docker did for virtualization. It is a very strong case, but it's simply too early, and the adoption is taking time because it's in a space that is unfortunately not as highly valued as it should be. Security is a similar sort of thing, so that's why I keep a lot of I keep an eye on the security developments and the tools related to security these days, because the need for IT security is growing. It's just that I also know that the IT industry is a lazy bum of an industry that doesn't care about security, because security is a cost that does not correlate to, as I said, delivery speed and simplicity and more code or like more usage of each individual developer. You can almost go as far as to say that the thing that IT loves, apart from like PR and coolness and recruitments and stuff like that, is how much can I squeeze out of each single developer. In a similar sense, that is exactly how the cloud infrastructure and so forth, like those sorts of technologies and innovations are working as well. So if you want to dehumanize yourself as a software developer, you can imagine yourself as being a computer on a rack in a server farm somewhere, and your company, like all of IT, is trying to figure out how can I make you work as hard as possible on as much as possible, while still while still maintaining like a control of cost and output and so forth and so forth. When you start learning how your industry works and you sort of start to see the patterns in how people make decisions in a company, and you see how companies conduct themselves, you start to figure out very quickly what's going to be a thing and what's probably not going to be a thing, and what's going to be a very short-lived thing that sounds like a good idea, but it's really just a hype. Have a great day.